everyone. Welcome to our talk this week. If we missed having you yesterday, we missed you. So we hope that you can join us again next week. We had a really good night. Jed led our session this week. It was a night on the 10th commandment, which is not to covet your neighbor's goods. So we started out, we played a game that you wrote like your ideal world and the different things that you would have if you could like have anything, or if you could live the kind of life that you wanted to live. How would you live your life? What would you do? And so we talked a little bit about that first, about the kind of things that we wanted, because there were things like, I'd be a professional football player. I would have my own personal jet. I would have, this news technology thing. I would have this game. I would have all these different things. So that's kind of where we started talking about like all the different material possessions that were on our lists. And that's a really common thing, because the world around us, when you look at all of the media, it seems like it promises us happiness if we have all of the right things. And if we're not happy with what we have, there's always something newer and better. I mean, I think that's especially true with like, phones, for instance, because it seems like as soon as you buy a new phone, there's like, oh, here's the newer model that has this thing instead of this, and this camera is this much better. And so there's just always something new and bigger and better. So our pursuit of happiness in the material world can be endless. We will feel like we never have quite enough, and our happiness can never be satisfied that way, because we never have all of the things that we think that we need to be happy. And so that's the root of what the 10th commandment is getting at. So again, the 10th commandment is, you shall not covet your neighbor's goods. And so God is warning us that when we focus too much on what we have and what we do not have, or even what other people have, we become unhappy, and we can thus be led into sin. So Jesus is not talking about the things we need for survival, like food and clothes and water and like a house and, safety, things like that. He's not talking about the things that we need for our survival, the necessity of life, but he's talking about like the extra goods. So it's not necessarily bad to want material things, especially if we get them through hard work, or if they're like gifts or things that are given to us. But when we continually focus on what we want, or on the things that others have that we also want to have, we can be driven to greed, avarice, and envy. Greed is when we have no limit to what we want. For example, greed might look like filling our closet with clothes that we do not need or even wear, because we just want more. Avarice is a passion for riches and the power that comes with them. We see this in the attitude people have toward making money, and the desire to be rich and famous as well, when they do not care about what the expenses that they have are and what they have to do to get there. Envy is a sadness that we feel when we see something that someone else has, along with an unhealthy desire to have what they have, no matter what it takes. So we live in this material world, and we see certain things that the world tells us this is what you need to have a comfortable life. But we have to keep what's most important in life in perspective. So we asked some of our youth to respond to the question, what's the most important thing in your life? And so there were some really good answers. I was just so... I don't know the word, I guess. I want to say proud, but it's not my doing, it's yours. I was just so happy to hear some of the things that like the youth talked about, and to hear the ways that they are not super attached to so many things, that they just kind of were like, well, I don't know, like if there was a fire in my house and I could only take one thing, it was things like that had sentimental value, that they were like, oh, there's this one book that my grandma gave me and it has like an inscription in the front, and things like that it was just really it was really beautiful to hear them talk about that. So I think that was something that I sat with the 8th grade table last night, because Emily had to leave early, and I just was so impressed by that, and by their the lack of materialism, I guess. And not to say that we don't think as people are walking by like, oh, I really like their sweatshirt, I wish I had that sweatshirt, but just the detachment with which they could look at that. So at any rate, it's not easy for us sometimes to overcome the allure of money and possessions. Some possessions are fun, some are comforting, and some bring us a certain amount of joy, but they're not meant to be the most important things in our lives. So while it may not seem obvious at first, our hearts can only be satisfied in God. So God created us, and He knows us, and He knows what will make us truly happy. And Jesus reveals to us the true path to holiness, which is to desire to be with Him more than to desire money and possessions. So Judd gave an example last night during his talk where he said, he thinks sometimes like if someone were to look in at his family as they're sitting in their home, just on a regular night, and someone were to watch his family, that they would think that what they worship and what their God is would be like screens. So he said, maybe I'm always picking up my phone and I'm texting, or I'm playing a game, or my son's always playing a video game on his phone, or we come in from like a day where we've worked at the office and we've been on the computer all day working, and then we come down and we sit down in front of the TV and we watch TV all night. And he said, so if people were to watch his family's life and his life from a casual perspective, and not really to know their hearts, they would say, yeah, obviously screens are their God. And how true is that, I think, for many, many families and for many of us. And so we talked about how that at the end of the day, sort of the things that we do reflect the desires of our hearts. So this commandment is not just for those who are rich, but for everyone, because like I said, we all struggle with that desire for material goods, that like seeing somebody walking past us with a new phone or with a new sweatshirt, or I said the thing that like I get most envious of is when somebody walks by with a dog. I just want to snuggle their dog and I want to like go over and like pet their dog. And I have my own dog and I love her, but it's still that thing of like, oh, I just love all those dogs. And so we all have our own things that as people walk past, or as people are around us and we're talking to people, that we're like, oh, you know what? My life would be way easier if I had that new car, or if I had a new computer, or all of those different things. So it doesn't matter whether we're rich, whether we're poor, whether we're anything in the middle. We all struggle with that desire for material goods, that we're trying to fill that hole inside of us that feels empty. So God gives us grace to turn away from an unhealthy love of our possessions and to turn to Him. He tells us that in order to attain heaven, we must learn to be detached from earthly things. So the example of this that we gave last night was, it's in Matthew, that Jesus talks about how it's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go to heaven. And I did say last night, and I'll say here too, that the important thing to remember in this is that the eye of the needle was actually a gate leading into the city of Jerusalem. And so we can sometimes tend to think like, Jesus, like, he told us all these like metaphorical things that, they're so lofty and high, high thought, but this is actually a literal gate into Jerusalem. And so in order for the camels to get in through this gate, they had to be unpacked. So normal camels, they come through and they have all of these different bags and things that they're carrying for whoever they're traveling with. But in order to get through the gate, they have to take off all of their things. And so when Jesus is saying that it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go to heaven, he's saying that for the camel to make it through, he has to unpack all of the things on his back. Just as we go through our lives, we have to unpack all of the material possessions and our attachment to those material possessions to make it through into the kingdom of heaven. We're called to find our comfort and our consolation in God, not in earthly things. And while sometimes this seems impossible, when we let go of our worries over material goods and trust in God, we find freedom from anxiety and the constant pressure to have more. It's not always easy, but with the grace of God and the help of God, we can find happiness and be free from our over-attachment to our possessions. We talked a little bit at the 8th grade table last night. We talked about, like, why did we feel like we had to have things? And, it was really profound that one of the youth said, sometimes like I just feel sad, and when I'm sad or I'm anxious or I'm struggling with like my anxiety, it like makes me feel better to have things. And so I thought that was such a profound thing for her to say and for her to see, that she can recognize that is like what is like making her want those things. And we talked about how like that is just filling this deep emptiness that we feel in ourselves sometimes, that sometimes we just feel like we are empty and there is something that is supposed to be fulfilling us that we do not feel fulfilled. And so we try to fill it with other things. But in truth, those things, they may seem like good and they may make us happy in the for a short amount of time, but in the long run, they don't actually fulfill that deep desire inside of us, right? And so it was a beautiful conversation that we got to have because of that youth, that she said, sometimes it's just like, I want this thing because I feel sad. And so we talked about, maybe how do we turn from that thing? Like, I want this thing, I want my phone. How do I turn from wanting to have my phone and wanting to play games? How do I turn from that thing to God instead to fill that need and to help fill that longing in our hearts? So like we said, one of the greatest challenges we face in our relationships with others is comparisons, right? So we compare not only our, like what we physically look like and what we think like and how we act and how our emotions are, we compare all of those things, but we also compare what we have to what they have, and vice versa. And so Jed shared this really good story last night about how when he was growing up, his parents used to get him a lot of things. He had, dirt bikes and, snowmobiles and all those different kind of like things that they could do outside, and that they had all these toys and all of these like physical material possessions. And he said, but his friend, growing up next to him, his friend didn't get a lot of things. His family was kind of poor, and so they didn't get all of those things, but his friend's dad spent time with him all the time. They'd go fishing and they'd go hunting and they'd go outside in the backyard and they'd play baseball. And they both used to look at each other and they would say, Jed's friend would say, oh man, I wish I had your dad, who was buying him all of those things and giving him all of those material possessions. And Jed would say, oh, I wish I had your dad, because your dad's always hanging out with you, and your dad's always like, taking you hunting and taking you on camping trips and doing all of those fun things. And so it just sort of like helped to solidify that we're always looking at like the things people have, whether it's material goods or whether it's relationships or all of those different things. We're always comparing ourselves and what we have to what other people have. And so sometimes it's not easy to be happy for someone else when they have like the latest and greatest thing, and then we want to have that thing. So sometimes it's not even easy to be happy about that. And we can't treat others differently based on what they own or what they get from it, because if we do that, we're simply using the other person, right? And so it's a struggle that we constantly go through to like feel happy for our friends when something good happens to them, and that's not the way God intended us to be. So as we continue to learn to love others as Jesus loves us, as well as to love our neighbor as ourselves, we have to have the attitude of sharing in someone's joy without letting that affect how we feel about ourselves. So if we work towards detachment of earthly things, it's easier to have a more authentic relationship with the people around us. And we're not constantly measuring ourselves to this other person, and it's easier for us to celebrate the joys with them. So this 10th commandment, it calls us to live our lives as lives of gratitude, to focus on what is most important in our lives and to pay attention to what we love most, because the thing that we love most should always be God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit. That should always be the thing that we love most. So when we learn to let go of that constant need for more things in order to be happy, and learn to love Jesus, the people in our lives more than we love our possession, we can find true happiness. So that was the lesson for this week. Next week we will go to doing commandment number 7. So we'll look forward to seeing you guys next week. Have a great weekend.